Hey everybody, it's Steve, and today we're talking about stabilized receivers for the Tandem line. We've covered the Tandem non-stabilized receivers in the past and went through all this, and I explained what all this stuff does and kind of talked about all the differences. And I hope you learned it. I'll have a link in the description so you can go back and watch that video. Reality is, uh, with the exception of the TDMX, we made all of these receivers, all four of these, all over again, put an S in there, and they're almost identical to the ones you see here. So the TDSR system has four different models, and you can see the price differences. They go from $60 to $145. And the question people might have about the stabilization system is it any good? Do I really need it? And I tend to be more skeptical than most people, so what I did when I started playing with this, and I did put them in my planes, started out with the Archer line in particular. I've had some bad experiences in the past with stabilization systems. I had a cheap one years ago, put it in my plane. It had a rat's nest of wires. Things didn't go in right. No real instructions to help it. It was just a bad experience all the way around. And I got flying. I didn't care for the way the plane flew. The gains were on these little pots. It was a nightmare. And so I was fairly reluctant to fly this simply because I just swore off stabilization systems after that. And so after getting one of ours set up correctly and taking it up for a flight, I turned on the stabilization system and said, yeah, this isn't bad. But it wasn't a really windy day. But I do recall that the plane tracked better. And then after a few minutes, I just noticed I wasn't turning it off, and I was just like, hey, this is nice. And it wasn't until I really got into a super windy day where I really saw that what the stabilization system does that I became a believer. And when that happened, when I was flying on a windy day, I was like, okay, this is an okay experience, but what's going to be like if I turn this off? After about 10 seconds, I couldn't turn it back on fast enough. It was like being in the rodeo. The plane was all over the place in the wind. So, yeah, these things are worth their weight in gold. They are really nice little systems, and I highly, highly recommend them. We have different modes. So the main mode that most people deal with is the stabilized mode. And the stabilized mode is essentially what I was describing before, these little micro corrections. I call them shock absorbers. And when you get bumps in the road, the shock absorber helps smooth it out. When you get changes in the, let's say, wind or something you're going through that causes a wing to dip, what it does is it corrects that very quickly, and it catches it before it becomes a bigger problem. Pretty much what happens is when you're flying and a wing starts to dip, you correct it, but by that point you have to see it happen, you have to process it in your mind, and then you have to make the movement on the stick, and then the transmitter has to transmit it to the receiver, and so all this adds up to a little bit of time. And what I find is that small problems become big problems because that's what happens within the course of half a second. But when you're making corrections much faster, much smaller, it's a lot less devastating. And what ends up happening is the plane flies straight and it tracks well, and it doesn't feel like it's flying all over the sky, even on super windy days. So that's the main mode that people fly with. There is a manual mode as well. You turn it on, the manual mode, when you, for me, I turn it on when I just want to trim the plane. I just want to get a feeling of the plane, see what it's like. I don't want anything interfering with the trim process. And then once the plane's trimmed, I will go back in stabilize mode to keep flying. Now, the time to use the last mode, which is called the self-level mode, two applications for that really stand out. Number one is when you're training new pilots. In fact, people will ask me when I'm out places talking about the transmitters, hey, you got the AS3X version of this? And that's a model of a spectrum receiver, but I know exactly what they're asking. What they're asking for is self-level mode, and I describe, well, we don't have the AS3X, but we do have a self-level mode, and it does work very well. It's very similar to what you're used to. Um, we also have the ability to change the pitch and roll in the self-level mode, so we can give it more pitch and more roll. The idea about the self-level mode is it prevents you from banking over too far one way or the other. It's especially important for new pilots who tend to have video game fingers, and they tend to throw the plane around to the extremes very quickly, especially when they get nervous. So it helps fight that off. But the other thing it does really nicely is if you're coming in for a landing and it's a windy day, you're getting some crosswind, and you're kind of nervous about the landing, it will keep the plane flying straight and level all the way down. So it's not going to land the plane for you, but it's absolutely going to help you out. Okay, so now we've talked about what they all have. Oh, the other thing I should mention too, there's two more modes. They're hover mode and the knife edge mode. These are specialty modes. They do work. I never play with them. The reason I don't play with them is you have to set up a separate switch, and then you have to work two switches, and remember the combination, the two switches, in order to work with it. Things change, and at some point I'm going to create logical conditions or something so that we can just put this all on one, maybe a slider or something like that, and go from one mode to another, and therefore you can just roll through it with the voices and get to play with all of them. But to have two separate switches set up, no thanks, I'm not into it. Okay, so let's talk about what these receivers, which way do they be better for which applications. Pretty much what I do is I cut these in half, and I say that these are more for like gas planes and these are more for electrics. However, you can use these in electric, and you can use these, you can use these in gas, and you can use these in electric. In general, I'll describe why I feel like they're better for certain applications. The 6-channel receiver, in a nutshell, there's a lot of planes that just don't really need a lot of channels. Especially putting a glider together right now, it does not have flaps. And because of that, because it has a very narrow fuselage, this TDS-R6 was brilliant. It was just the perfect size, and it fits in perfectly. If you're flying a flying wing that only has elevons, so you're using 3 channels at the most, TDS-R6 perfect for that. And then there's a lot of planes that are sold at hobby stores, and they always seem to have wide cables to get these planes working, especially for flaps and ailerons. And no matter how complex they are, they always make them work with 6 channels magically. So if somebody wants to do a swap out and just have everything work, this is a nice little receiver to work with. It's also fairly inexpensive. When you get to the TDS-R10, it gets to be about $30 more. TDS-R10, in my book, is going to be a very interesting one to look at. These are both very new receivers, by the way. These just came out towards the end of 2023. The TDR10 was a big seller. It is probably our #1 receiver. We just tend to sell a lot of that one. It is beloved by so many. So the TDS-R10, I feel, is going to be also beloved, especially for people who need to do some configurations on their pins, so that you can change the channel on the pin. So pin 3 can be channel 6, 9, 12, 14, whatever you feel like. It could be S-bus out, it can be smart port, it can be F-bus. If you want to do S-bus in, it's only available on channel 1, and so I always try to make a pin 1, I should say. Always try to make a note of it right there that it's on pin 1 is your S-bus in, and what you usually do is you take channel 1 and put it somewhere on a pin that you're not using. So this one is the one to watch, I say. However, if you're flying a gas, you're looking at, let's see, 90, it's about $40 difference, no, $30 difference between these two. And yeah, it's going to be night and day different. the XT30s that come with the TDSR12 make for something that can handle a plane that is perhaps a sports jet 2 meters and smaller. Will handle all the electrics, handle EDFs. It'll handle anything that doesn't have superpower hungry servos. And then the thing I always point out is that it handles 30 amps at an instant current, and then continuous current it drops down to 20 amps. If you're flying with huge servos, you might seriously consider spending the extra $25 and getting the TDSR18, simply because instant current is 60 amps and continuous current is 30 amps. So that's going to work for just about the vast majority of planes out there. There are a few guys who fly super large planes that are super expensive, and then they want to use big central boxes for everything. And for those folks, I say, yeah, go right ahead. But for a lot of them, a lot of these guys are overkill. For $150, you have the stabilization system built into the receiver, and you also have your power management for your servos. And if you can make it work, it's going to be a lot less complexity in your big planes, and especially your jets, and you will pretty much be very thankful that you don't have to go through all the setup, because to work with all those redundancy boxes, pretty much you're going to be working with multiple receivers, and it just becomes a bit more of a hassle than it's worth. So I would say that this is, first, if you're just looking for a stabilized receiver, if your plane's not exceptionally large, 2 meters and under for turbine, and just about all the EDFs, I would say that one of these receivers will work exceptionally well for your particular use. If you have any questions, please feel free to leave them in the comments, and thanks for watching.